Massachusetts is one of the oldest states in the country. People have been settling, thriving, and leaving here for nearly 400 years. And some of those places they left behind, still standing, or sinking, or, in a few cases, sitting at the bottom of a reservoir. Today we're looking at 7 unbelievable ghost towns in Massachusetts. Ghost Town number 7, Dogtown, Gloucester/Rockport. Let's start with a place that sounds like it was named by someone who gave up on being creative. And honestly, the name fits perfectly. Dogtown. That's it. That's what people decided to call it. And before you ask, yes, there's a story behind it, and yes, it involves actual dogs. Dogtown sits on Cape Ann, split between the modern cities of Gloucester and Rockport, about an hour north of Boston. The settlement was first established in the early 1640s, when colonists decided that living right on the coastline was, frankly, a terrible idea. Pirates were a real and frequent problem along the New England coast. Relations with native populations were tense, and the threat of British ships appearing on the horizon wasn't purely theoretical. So a group of settlers moved inland, found a patch of high ground a few miles from the water, and started building. They called it the Common Settlement. It wasn't glamorous land. The soil was rocky and poor, not great for growing crops. So instead of farming wheat or corn, the settlers raised livestock, cattle, sheep, whatever could survive the terrain. The pine forests around them provided timber for building, and for a few generations, the community actually held together reasonably well. At its largest, sometime in the mid to late 1700s, the common settlement had around 75 homes and upwards of 100 families. It was, by some accounts, the most prosperous area on Cape Ann at the time, which tells you something about how rough the rest of Cape Ann was back then. Then the world changed around it. After the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, the threat of British bombardment faded, the coastline became safe again, and new roads were built connecting the interior of Cape Ann to Gloucester's increasingly booming fishing industry. One by one, the families of the common settlement packed up and moved toward the harbor, where the real economic action was. The soil wasn't going to get any better. The fishing economy absolutely was. By the time the War of 1812 was over, the place was nearly empty. A few stragglers remained, mostly elderly women whose husbands had gone to sea and never returned, or people who had simply run out of options. Some of those women were rumored to be practicing witchcraft. In early 19th century New England, that reputation was basically a social death sentence. Packs of stray dogs began wandering the abandoned lanes, dogs the remaining women had kept for company and protection during their years alone. When the last residents finally left, the dogs stayed. And that's how the common settlement became Dogtown. The last known resident left around 1830. One of the final holdouts was a woman named Thomasine Tammy Younger, a well-known local fortune teller. After her, the cellar holes of the old homes were left open to the sky, and the forest began its slow work of taking everything back. For about a century, the place sat largely forgotten. Locals from surrounding towns used parts of the land for grazing. Gradually, the forest reclaimed the clearings. The old roads became trails. The stone walls built by colonists 200 years earlier disappeared into the undergrowth. Then, in the 1930s, Dogtown got something genuinely strange added to it. Roger Babson, the founder of Babson College and a man with strong opinions about personal responsibility and financial discipline, hired unemployed stonecutters during the Great Depression to carve motivational phrases into the large boulders scattered throughout the forest. The carvings are still there today. You're hiking through the ruins of a colonial settlement, tripping over centuries-old cellar holes, and then you turn a corner, and a boulder says, "Never try, never win, or keep out of debt." It is deeply weird. It is also, somehow, very Massachusetts. The trails are open to the public. The cellar holes, dozens of them, are scattered throughout the woods, quiet depressions in the earth marking where someone's home once stood. There are over 100 numbered cellar holes mapped across the Dogtown area. each one the ghost of a foundation someone built with the intention of staying. The carved boulders catch you off guard every time. Babson reportedly funded the project in part because he believed idleness was destroying American character during the Depression, and he wanted the message literally set in stone. Whether or not you share his philosophy, the effect in context is genuinely unsettling. Dogtown is eerie in a way that's hard to describe until you're actually standing in it. Colonial ruins, rock carvings, and the knowledge that a place this close to a major American city has been completely swallowed by forest for nearly 200 years. Ghost Town number 6, Dana, Quabbin Reservoir. Here's where things take a genuinely heartbreaking turn and stay there for a while. Dana was a real functioning town in central Massachusetts. It was first settled in 1676, incorporated as its own town on February 18, 1801. And for over a century, it did exactly what small New England towns do. It had a post office, a hotel, schools, a church, a town hall, farms. People were born there, raised families there, buried their parents and grandparents there. It was not glamorous. It was not famous. It was just a town doing the ordinary work of being a town for generations. And then the Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided it needed more water. Boston was growing rapidly in the early 20th century. The existing water supply couldn't keep pace with the city's expanding population. Engineers and planners identified the Swift River Valley in central Massachusetts as the ideal location for a massive new reservoir. The valley was naturally suited for it, surrounded by hills, fed by multiple rivers and streams, and remote enough from Boston that the construction project wouldn't disrupt the capital. The only problem was the 4 towns sitting in the middle of it: Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. The Swift River Act was passed in 1927, and from that point on, the clock was ticking for all 4 communities. Over the next decade, the process of erasure was systematic. Homes were either demolished or physically moved to other locations. Businesses closed, schools shut down. The state undertook the grim task of exhuming more than 7,600 bodies from local cemeteries and reburying them elsewhere. By April 28, 1938, all 4 towns were officially disincorporated by the state legislature. Dana, sitting at a slightly higher elevation than the other 3 towns, wasn't entirely submerged when the waters rose. Much of the actual town center ended up above the waterline. What remains today is an unusual and melancholy place. Old stone foundations sitting in the middle of the woods, an empty field where the town cemetery once stood, the old town common, marked by memorial stones, honoring the buildings that once surrounded it. The road into Dana is closed to vehicles, but hikers can walk in on Old Dana Road and stand where the center of a living community once was. The weight of the place is hard to shake. You're not walking through a town that slowly emptied out because opportunities dried up. You're walking through a town that was deliberately unmade. The decision was made somewhere else, by people who didn't live there, and the people who did live there were told to leave. We are losing our homes, our farms, our neighbors, our whole way of life, one former resident wrote about the displacement. It is a sacrifice, but it is one being made for the common good. The Quabbin Reservoir has provided clean drinking water to more than 3 million people in eastern Massachusetts ever since. That's not a small thing. The reservoir itself is now considered one of the largest unfiltered water supplies in the United States, and the protected land surrounding it has become an important wildlife habitat, home to bald eagles, fisher cats, and other species that have returned to the area over the decades since the towns were flooded. Nature, as it often does, moved in quickly once the people moved out. But standing in the ruins of Dana, it's still a complicated thing to feel uncomplicated about. Ghost Town number 5, Enfield, Quabbin Reservoir. Enfield was the largest of the 4 drowned towns, and in some ways it carries the most vivid story of the bunch. At its peak in the 1800s, Enfield had nearly 1,000 residents. substantial by rural Massachusetts standards. The Swift River ran through the valley and powered a cluster of mills that gave the town a real economic backbone. There were multiple churches, a main street with businesses, a hotel, farms spread across the surrounding hills. The town looked like a place that intended to be around for a long time. The decline started before the reservoir was ever proposed. By the early 1900s, the mills were struggling to compete with larger industrial operations elsewhere in the state. Young people were leaving for Boston, Springfield, Worcester, anywhere with more opportunity. By the time the Swift River Act was passed in 1927, Enfield's population had already fallen to around 500. In some ways, the reservoir simply accelerated a trajectory the town was already on. That doesn't make it less painful for the people who lived through it, but it's part of the honest picture. The decade between the act and the actual disincorporation was a slow, strange kind of limbo. People were selling off their homes and property, watching their neighbors leave one by one, watching the physical fabric of the town get dismantled around them. Buildings were moved. Others were torn down. Residents who had spent their entire lives in Enfield were being asked to reconstruct those lives somewhere else, on someone else's schedule. What makes Enfield's story unforgettable is how the town said goodbye. On the evening of April 27th, 1938, the night before the towns were officially dissolved, Enfield held a farewell ball on its town green. An orchestra played. Hundreds of people came, including former residents who had already moved away and came back for one final night. People danced. Old neighbors reconnected. Everyone in that room knew exactly what was happening, and they danced anyway. At midnight, when April 28th arrived and the town of Enfield legally ceased to exist, the music stopped. There's no good way to follow that. It stands as one of the more quietly devastating moments in Massachusetts history, and it barely rates a footnote in most accounts of the state. Today, Enfield is underwater. In severe drought years, when the reservoir level drops significantly, remnants of the old town have occasionally surfaced, sections of road, fragments of stone foundation, visible above the waterline before disappearing again as the reservoir refills. It's the kind of thing that explains why people around the Quabbin still talk about those four towns the way they do, decades later. There is a Swift River Valley Historical Society, based in the nearby town of New Salem, that has worked for years to preserve the history and artifacts of the four drowned communities. If you want to understand what Enfield and its neighbors actually looked and felt like, it's worth a visit. The society holds records, photographs, and personal accounts from people who lived through the disincorporation. Some of the last residents were still alive well into the late 20th century. People who had danced at that final ball as children and spent the rest of their lives somewhere else. Ghost Town number 4, Prescott, Quabbin Reservoir. Prescott was the smallest of the 4 Quabbin towns, and in some ways it's had the most interesting historical afterlife. The town was incorporated in 1822, carved out of portions of Pelham and New Salem. It was never large. At its population peak around 1900, Prescott had only about 300 residents. Farming was the primary livelihood. There wasn't much industry, no significant mill economy, nothing in particular that put it on anyone's radar. It was a small rural town that existed quietly in the hills of central Massachusetts for over a century. But the land that became Prescott had a more charged history than its modest size suggested. Parts of the area were what the province of Massachusetts Bay once called equivalent lands, territory made available to settlers from the Connecticut colony as compensation for old colonial land disputes. It was frontier country, rough land offered to people willing to work it. More dramatically, Prescott was directly tied to Shays' Rebellion, the 1786 to 1787 armed uprising by Massachusetts farmers who were being crushed by debt and taxes in the years after the Revolution. Continental Army veterans who had fought for independence came home to find creditors seizing their farms and courts, throwing debtors into prison. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, organized the resistance. The rebellion failed militarily, but it alarmed the Founding Fathers so significantly that some historians argue it was a direct catalyst for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Daniel Shays' own home was located in what became the town of Prescott. The cellar hole of Conkey's Tavern, where Shays and his followers reportedly met to plan the rebellion, was in the same area. Both of those sites now sit somewhere beneath the waters of the Quabbin Reservoir. There's a saying in that part of Massachusetts, half joke, half real grievance, that the flooding of the Swift River Valley towns was Boston's revenge for Shays' rebellion. Western Massachusetts farmers rose up against the Eastern establishment in 1786. A century and a half later, the Eastern establishment built a reservoir on their land and named it after a scenic body of water that no longer existed, Quabbin Lake, which was itself swallowed in the process. Whether that's coincidence or historical irony depends entirely on where you're standing when you hear it. Robert Lord Keyes, a local historian who spent years researching the area, noted that even the Massachusetts Historical Society had at one point blocked a proposal to mark Daniel Shays' grave because, in their words, Massachusetts had no interest in monuments to traitors. The land of Shays was then put underwater. Make of that what you will. Ghost Town number 3, Catamount, Coleraine. We move now from the flooded valleys of central Massachusetts all the way to the far western edge of the state, up into Franklin County, into the hills near the town of Coleraine, where a small and stubborn farming community called Catamount once made its home on the slopes of a mountain. Catamount was settled sometime in the mid to late 1700s. The historical record is not precise about when, which is itself a clue about how remote and lightly documented this community was. The settlers who came here chose difficult ground. Mountain terrain meant poor soil, short growing seasons, and a level of isolation that would have tested most people's patience considerably, but they stayed for generations, which says something about either their determination or their lack of better options, probably both. The community was small throughout its entire existence. It didn't generate the kind of economic activity that produced written records or local newspaper coverage. It simply existed, quietly and stubbornly, in the hills of western Massachusetts, while the rest of the state went through industrialization and the transformation of the 19th century economy without it. But Catamount had one moment that placed it firmly in American history. In 1812, the schoolhouse at Catamount became the first school in the United States to fly the American flag over its building. Before this, it was not standard practice. Schools did not routinely display the flag. The teacher and community at Catamount did it first. That small wooden schoolhouse on a mountainside in western Massachusetts established what eventually became a universal tradition across the country. Every school flag you've ever seen traces that practice back to this community. For a place that barely left a footprint in the historical record, that is a genuinely remarkable thing to have started. The early 20th century was the end. The farming that had sustained Catamount for generations couldn't compete with the changing world outside the mountains. Young people left for better prospects. Older residents died or followed their children out. The community faded quietly in the early 1900s, not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually and completely. In 1967, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts purchased most of the land and created Catamount State Forest. What remains today is almost nothing. There is a stone marker in the woods indicating where the schoolhouse once stood. That's essentially the sum total of what's left. No dramatic ruins to explore, no picturesque remnants of a lost village, just a stone in the forest, a trail through the trees, and a story that almost nobody knows. Catamount may be the quietest ghost town on this list, but somebody has to be first, and it was Catamount. It's worth pausing on that for a second, because the flag thing gets treated as a trivia footnote when it's actually more interesting than that. The practice of flying the flag at schools wasn't mandated federally until the late 19th century, and even then, the adoption was gradual. What the Catamount schoolhouse started in 1812 was a cultural shift that took decades to complete. And the community that started it was so small and so remote that it was effectively forgotten within a century of doing it. The stone marker in the woods is, in some ways, more honest than a formal monument would be. A quiet acknowledgement of a quiet place that did one consequential thing and then disappeared. Ghost Town number 2, Davis, Row. Now for a ghost town that owes its entire existence to a mineral deposit and its entire disappearance to what happens when you mine that deposit without much regard for structural integrity. Davis was a mining community in the hills of what is now the town of Row, in Franklin County in far western Massachusetts. It came into being in the late 19th century after a man named H.J. Davis discovered significant deposits of iron pyrite in the area. Iron pyrite, also known as fool's gold for its metallic yellow gleam, has legitimate industrial uses. In the late 1800s, it was an important raw material for producing sulfuric acid, which was used across a range of industrial and chemical processes. So when Davis found the deposit, there was real economic value sitting in that hillside. This wasn't just a shiny rock. The mine expanded quickly. At its height, it was the largest iron pyrite mine in Massachusetts. Workers arrived, and with them came families. And with families came the infrastructure of a community. Housing, a blacksmith shop, the basic outline of a settlement deep in the hills of Franklin County. It wasn't large by any measure, but it was a real place with a real economy, organized entirely around one mine. That kind of single industry foundation works right up until it doesn't. In 1911, poor mining practices caused the mine to collapse. No workers were killed in the collapse, which, given the era and the conditions, was fortunate, but the mine itself was finished. Once the mine stopped producing, the reason for living in that particular corner of Massachusetts vanished pretty quickly. There was no fallback, no other industry, no agricultural economy, nothing to absorb the displaced workers. Over the following 2 decades, the settlement emptied out. By the 1930s, Davis was a ghost town. What the departing residents left behind are approximately 150 cellar holes, the stone foundations of their homes, arranged across the landscape in the outline of a community that no longer exists. The remains of the old blacksmith shop are still there. All of it is on public land and can be explored on foot. 150 cellar holes. That's 150 households who came to this remote part of Massachusetts because there was work in the mine, built something that looked like a life there, and then had to leave when the ground gave out beneath them. The whole arc, discovery, growth, collapse, abandonment, played out in less than 40 years. Davis is rarely mentioned in mainstream accounts of Massachusetts history. It doesn't show up on casual tourist itineraries. But it's a clean, uncomplicated story about what happens when a community is built entirely on one thing and that one thing stops working. There's no villain, no grand political decision, no natural disaster with dramatic visuals, just a mine that collapsed and silence afterward. In some ways, that ordinariness makes it more affecting than the more famous ghost towns. Plenty of places have been ruined by spectacle. Davis was ruined by physics. Ghost Town number 1, Whitewash Village, Monomoy Island. For the final entry, we leave the mainland entirely. Monomoy Island is a barrier island off the elbow of Cape Cod, a narrow strip of sand and dune extending south from Chatham into Nantucket Sound. Today, it's a national wildlife refuge managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, home to populations of gray seals, migratory shorebirds, and the kind of remote coastal quiet that's genuinely hard to find anymore. Getting there requires a boat. There are no roads, no regular ferry, no bridge. It is, in the most complete sense of the phrase, in the middle of nowhere. Sometime around 1710, people decided to live there anyway. The settlement on Monomoy grew slowly, and by the mid-1800s had developed into a small but functional fishing village. The waters surrounding Monomoy were extraordinarily productive, rich with cod, mackerel, and lobster, sitting at the intersection of currents and feeding grounds that made the area one of the better fishing locations anywhere on the Cape Cod coastline. The isolation that would seem impractical from most perspectives was, from a fisherman's standpoint, actually convenient. You were already out there. You were already near the fish. At its peak, around 200 people lived in Whitewash Village. That's enough to sustain a school, a post office, and the small businesses that served a working fishing economy. The village was named, most likely, for the whitewashed appearance of its simple wooden buildings against the flat, open landscape of the island. It wasn't a picturesque place by any conventional measure. It was a working place, and it looked exactly like that. The problem with living on a barrier island is that barrier islands don't stay still. They shift, erode, and reshape themselves with every significant storm. The residents of Whitewash Village lived with that reality for roughly 150 years because the fishing made it worth accepting. And then, in 1860, a hurricane hit Monomoy Island and settled the question definitively. The storm destroyed the village. Homes were swept away. Structures collapsed. What 200 people had built over a century and a half was gone in a matter of hours. The residents evacuated. And then, with what seems like admirable clarity about their situation, they simply didn't come back. There's no complicated narrative of failed attempts to rebuild, or of a community torn between attachment and practicality. They left, looked back at a sandbar in the Atlantic that had just flattened everything they owned, and decided that was enough. Hard to argue with that. The lighthouse on Monomoy Point Light, a cast-iron structure built in 1849 to guide vessels through the treacherous shoals surrounding the island, survived the storm and still stands. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1979 and is occasionally accessible to visitors through organized tours out of Chatham, but the village itself is gone. The sand has shifted over the site for more than 160 years. There are no foundations to walk through, no cellar holes to find, no stone markers. The island has reclaimed everything, and whatever physical traces remain of Whitewash Village are either buried in dunes or lost to the sound. Visiting Monomoy today requires arranging a boat from Chatham, which keeps casual foot traffic down and preserves the island's genuinely remote quality. The seals haul out on the beaches in large numbers. Gray seals in particular have made something of a comeback here, which is its own remarkable story. The shorebirds come through by the thousands during migration. Piping plovers nest on the beaches in spring. It's a compelling, living place now, which makes the silence around the absence of Whitewash Village even more noticeable once you know to look for it. Somewhere beneath the sand and seagrass, a fishing village that vanished in a single storm is still, technically, there. Nobody's checked lately. And nobody's planning to build there again, which is probably the right call. Massachusetts has a way of burying its history, sometimes literally, as we've seen today. Under reservoirs, under forests, under sand dunes, and the open Atlantic. These 7 places all went quiet for different reasons. Government decisions, economic collapse, geography, weather, and the slow, patient work of time. But each one was a real place where real people built something they intended to keep. And the fact that most people driving through Massachusetts right now have never heard of Dogtown or Dana or Whitewash Village, that's exactly what makes them worth talking about. History doesn't always go where the crowds are. If you got something out of this video, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are curious about the same kinds of stories. And if you want to keep going down the rabbit hole of forgotten places and overlooked history, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's a lot more ground to cover. Thanks for watching.